I've spent the last few weeks in Orlando, Florida, and spent a lot of that time in Walt Disney World. And when at Walt Disney World, you tend to see a lot of princesses, specifically the Disney princesses. The Disney princesses are this official canon of characters from across Disney movies, which are often placed together for marketing and merchandise reasons. This franchise has made over $1 billion for Disney, so it's no surprise that you see a lot of them in the theme parks and on lunchboxes. In the films and media these princesses appear in, they all natively speak English, as they are products of the American company of Disney. I say natively as these films are also translated into many different languages. Yet despite all these characters having English as their first tongue, that really shouldn't be the case. The stories of these princesses take place all across the globe in different time periods, from medieval Europe to ancient Asia, Polynesia, and even turn of the century New Orleans. These princesses really shouldn't all be speaking English. So despite the fact I was on my holidays and not meant to be thinking about language, I couldn't help but ponder what languages all these Disney princesses really ought to be speaking. And of course, there is no correct answer for many of these. Disney has never officially confirmed what languages they should all actually be speaking. This video is going to be mainly speculation based on elements seen in the movies, such as the geographic setting and time period, as well as facts about the original stories many of these films are based on. And also for this video, we are focusing on just the 13 who are officially recognized as Disney princesses. This doesn't include many characters you may expect it to, and weirdly enough, it doesn't include Anna or Elsa from Frozen. This is thought to be either because they aren't princesses but queens, or because they are popular enough to be merchandise on their own away from the princess banner. The first character to be well and truly considered a Disney princess, however, is Snow White. Snow White is believed to live in the early to mid 16th century in Germanic-speaking Europe. We can figure this out from the look of the film and because it's based on a fairy tale published by the Brothers Grimm, who were Germanic in origin. Because of this, we could say that Snow White really ought to be speaking German, but it isn't as easy as that. For most of its history, Germany was not a single nation but a patchwork of smaller kingdoms. During the 16th century, when Snow White most likely takes place, the land was mainly under Prussian and Holy Roman Empire rule. This patchwork of kingdoms was reflected in the language too, as instead of there being one standard German language like there is now, all these places spoke different forms of the Germanic tongue. It is more or less impossible to pinpoint which variety she would have spoken, so I'm going to go with Low German. I'm going with Low German as it's the form of German the Brothers Grimm was seemingly linked with. The next princess, Cinderella, is often thought to be German too, but that most likely isn't the case. While the Brothers Grimm did have a version of the story, the Disney film is based far more on a French retelling by Charles Perrault. This has led many to believe that the film is actually set in France. This is helped along by other things like some of the characters' names. Time-wise, it's thought to take place in either the late 18th or early 19th century. This means that Cinderella really could have been speaking something akin to modern French, as by this time French was somewhat similar to how it is now. But despite all this, it has got a strong German vibe too, so maybe it's set somewhere in the French-German border region where they speak both languages to various degrees, who knows. The next princess is Aurora from Sleeping Beauty, and it's incredibly easy to figure out when this film is set, as one of the characters literally says, "This is the 14th century, which makes things incredibly easy for us. It's also seemingly set in France too, as an older version of the French national anthem is heard in the film. This means that Aurora would have spoken French too, but not an as modern version of the language like Cinderella. It would have either been Old or Middle French, as it was during the 14th century that the language shifted from its Old to Middle version. Then we have Ariel. This is the hardest one to figure out, mainly because she's a mermaid, and as far as I'm aware, mermaids aren't real, so she doesn't have a real language to speak. Of course she does find herself on the surface, but even then, she doesn't have a voice for the majority of her time on the land. For this one, we need to more figure out the language of the other humans in the film, and this is really hard to figure out. Ariel's underwater kingdom is definitely somewhere in the Atlantic, so we can presume the land is somewhere which borders this ocean. Many go with Denmark because the original story originates from here, but I don't quite buy that, mainly because the land doesn't look particularly Danish, and many of Ariel's underwater friends like Flounder and co look incredibly tropical, and not like the kind of creatures you may find in the North Sea next to Denmark. So we need to find somewhere that borders the Atlantic and is within that tropical zone, and because of this, I landed on somewhere in the Caribbean. This isn't perfect by any means. When Eric gives Ariel a tour of the kingdom, it doesn't look hugely Caribbean, but it looks somewhat more Caribbean than Danish in my eyes, at least the geography does anyway. It has has a somewhat similar appearance to colonial settlements like Port Royal in Jamaica. Eric and the other humans could very well be English colonizers, which would also give us an idea as to when this film is set to, being sometime from the 16th century to the 18th century, during the time the Caribbean was under colonial rule. So Ariel could have possibly been speaking English, or even Spanish, as they had claims in the Caribbean too. The Little Mermaid is undoubtedly the hardest of these to pinpoint, so feel free to tell me I'm wrong down below. The other reason I like to place it in the Caribbean is because of the real mermaids that can be found in this part of the world too. During the age of colonization, sailors would often think they had spotted mermaids, but they were actually West Indian manatees. Manatees can be found all across the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and of course in Florida to this day, and they are still very much linked with mermaids. This manatee-mermaid link is another reason why I like to think the film is set there. Also, I got to see manatees while in Florida, the wonderful town of Crystal River, so I just have manatees on the mind possibly. Belle from Beauty and the Beast meanwhile is a lot easier to figure out. The film famously takes place in France, specifically a region to the east. It seemingly takes place in around the 18th century too, meaning we once again have another French-speaking princess. We finally have our first Asian princess with Jasmine from Aladdin. The film is set in the city of Agrabah, which is heavily inspired by Baghdad in the modern nation of Iraq, but the film is inspired by the wider Arabian world too. Due to this, it should come as no surprise to hear that Jasmine would realistically be speaking Arabic. She would have spoken what we now call classical Arabic. This is down to the simple fact that the story most likely takes place in the 18th century, as the story has its ultimate origins from the 1001 Nights, a collection of Arabian folk tales, also commonly known as the Arabian Nights, which was first published in the 18th century. Pocahontas is undoubtedly the easiest one to figure out, as she was actually a real human. The film is set in Jamestown in 1607, while still under British rule. The real Pocahontas was part of the Powhatan tribe, meaning she would have spoken the Powhatan language. Yet the real Pocahontas actually learned English too, meaning she could be our first bilingual princess. Mulan, meanwhile, isn't based on a real person, but a legendary figure from China's past. Hua Mulan is a Chinese folk heroine. The earliest mention we have of her comes from the Northern Wei dynasty from the 6th century. Northern Wei would have spoken a language called Middle Chinese, also known as Che-un, so we can imagine this is what Mulan would have spoken to. But from one of the oldest princesses to the one who lived in the most recent time. Tiana from The Princess and the Frog lives in New Orleans in the early 20th century. This means that Tiana could very well actually have spoken English, or she might speak French due to the language's influence here, or she may speak Louisiana Creole too, a Creole language inspired by French, or possibly Cajun English, a version of English spoken by the native Cajun people of the land. Disney returned back to Europe, however, in Tangled, featuring the Princess of Rapunzel. You may think that this one is set in the Middle Ages too, but it's actually more recent than that. The main giveaway here is the fact that Mozart is mentioned, and as he lived in the 18th century, it's safe to assume it's set sometime during or after his life. Beyond this reference, some other things give this away too, like certain fashion choices. While that answers when it was set, it's a tad harder to pinpoint where. The film officially takes place on the island kingdom of Corona. Where Corona is exactly isn't specifically mentioned. Theories seem to place it either somewhere near to France or Germany. France because of certain fashion choices, and the name Corona coming from Latin, and French is also a Romance language, and Germany because once again this is based on another grim story. I personally like to side with France, simply because they have more possible ocean for the island to reside in than Germany. Plus it looks an awful lot like Mont Saint Michel, which is in France. This makes Rapunzel yet another French speaker. Brave's Merida, however, is the only Disney princess to actually be a concoction of Pixar. This film is undeniably Scottish, and is thought to be set around the 10th century. While English is now the predominant language of Scotland, back in the 10th century, it was only just starting to be spoken there. At this time, the native Scottish Gaelic tongue was the go-to language, and this is the one Merida most probably would have actually spoken. Moana, meanwhile, lives in a completely different part of the world. The film is set in Polynesia in the South Pacific, specifically on the fictional island of Motunui. This island and the film is inspired by various Polynesian islands, nations and people ranging from Hawaii, Samoa, Tahiti, and the Maori people of New Zealand. Of these languages, Moana most likely would have either spoken Fijian, Tongan, or Samoan. This is because the film is thought to take place during a period of Polynesian history known as the Long Pause. This was the gap between the first Polynesian people arriving on the islands of Fiji, Tahiti and Samoa and the rest of the islands becoming inhabited. It's thought to be around a 1,000 year time period, and Moana itself is believed to have been set around 2,000 years ago, making her the oldest Disney princess by a long shot. We believe it's set during the long pause, as a key part of the story are the people of her island searching for new lands. But out of these three languages, I'm going to say Samoan, as it's the most widely spoken of the three. There is, however, a real place called Motunui in New Zealand, so maybe she does actually speak Maori. And then we have the newest princess, Raya from Raya and the Last Dragon. This film has the most fantastical setting of all the Disney princess movies, being set in the fictional Kumandala realm. This place is heavily inspired by a variety of Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia and Thailand. While all inspired by these areas, it is not directly in any of them. This means it's hard to pinpoint an exact time setting too, being inspired by the far past of this part of the world in general. If I had to pick a single language she may actually speak, it would either be Malaysian, as that's the most widely spoken Southeast Asian language, or Vietnamese, as the person who voices Raya, Kelly Marie Tran, is of Vietnamese ancestry. While the Disney princess line has its roots in the fairy tales of medieval Europe, it has since expanded to include stories inspired by cultures from all corners of the earth. If these films were made in the languages of these places too, then we can imagine it's the tongues mentioned throughout this video these princesses would really speak. Though, like I said, this is all just speculation. Honestly, I'm still super jet lagged and exhausted from my time away in Disney World. It's a Small World is still just playing over and over in my head at this point. I need to go lie down.
Name Explained depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explained videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/NameExplain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm NameExplainYT, and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.